Okay, this last part of the lecture, well, I might break it into two parts depending on how long it goes. But this is about a slightly different topic. It's about the American higher education system, colleges and universities. Um, and this is not a topic that people would usually cover in a linguistics class or a professionalization seminar. But given that some of our students are considering going into academia for a career, I think it's really important to understand exactly how this sector works in the United States. And even for those of you who are not thinking of spending your career in academia, this is going to be important background information for understanding where you are right now at West Virginia University, where the undergraduates that you're teaching might be coming from, and what the general situation is at our colleges and universities in this country, because it's very, very different than it works in most other countries. And so this is going to go through a little bit of the financing and the priorities of American universities in a way that's usually not covered anywhere in any university class, but I think it's really essential information to understand about how our higher education system works. Okay, so sort of background here. The traditional model of what a university is from roughly the 11th century to the 1970s, right, is that both public and private universities are funded. Who are they funded by? Well, in the United States, this is mostly going to be a mix of funding from the state governments. To a lesser extent, the federal government has played some role in this. Philanthropy, so basically wealthy individuals who give money to institutions, and also grants. These generally come from either private foundations or the federal government, mostly associated with scientific research, but there can be all different kinds of grants. Basically, public universities are funded by state governments in the United States for most of their history. The United States also has a long tradition of private universities. This is very different than other countries. And those are generally funded by philanthropic donations. In fact, some of the largest American private universities were started by very wealthy business people who basically started the universities as a charitable project. And then it's possible for a private university to get grants from either the government or a private institution. And private universities have always charged some amount of tuition. Public universities have also always charged some amount of tuition in the United States, but that has been usually a token amount that's far less than the actual cost of running the university. And that's still the case in most of Western Europe. Although it's changing to some extent in various countries. Private universities are really the only ones who get a significant chunk of their revenue from tuition up until the 1970s or so. Then something changed. So this chart is from California, and it was easier to find data in California than any other state. And California has a lavish and spectacular public university system. It's probably the best public university system in the world, certainly the best one in the country. And this is the percentage of the California state budget, the entire state's budget, that's spent on public higher education in California from the 1960s until the 2010s. And what you can see here is that this has dropped precipitously, right? So at the end of the 1960s, the University of California and the Cal State systems were taking up somewhere from 15 to 20% of the entire budget of the state of California. And by 2010, that's gone down to about 11% or so, maybe up hovering around 12, and so on and so forth. So that is a giant drop in funding. You can see this as well. This is for the entire country. And rather than stating university budgets as a proportion of the state budget, this is giving you state funding for each student at a university. So this full-time equivalent student, this is adjusting for inflation. And it's saying, well, let's set at zero the amount that every state government or federal government, this is only state governments, are paying per student for their university systems in 2000, and then see how that amount changes over time. And as you can see here, it's gone down from somewhere from 30 to 35% just in this 15-year period from 2000 to 2014, right? So again, giant drop in state funding for public universities over this time. This is showing you average state and local funding per full-time equivalent student, again adjusting for inflation here, and this looks like across the country, so it's showing you just a similar picture. This one has time periods of recessions highlighted, and what you can see is that in general the funding goes down, especially when you calculate it per student. That's this dark line. The lighter line is going to be overall funding, but the number of students is increasing over this period. And so after a recession, generally funding goes down, and then at some point it comes back up again. Funding goes down, it starts coming back up. This is the giant recession in 2007 to 2009 that we all lived through. And here the funding goes way, way down after this one, and it never quite gets back up to where it was before that recession happened. So this chart only goes up to 2015, but as of 2 or 3 years later, this is showing you for every state in the United States how much funding has dropped during that recession and has never come back up to pre-recession levels, right? So this is, again, per full-time equivalent student. Almost every state in the country has dropped funding over this 10-year period per student and has never brought it back up again to the level it was at before the recession. This is radically true in some places. There's a few states that have actually let their funding recover. West Virginia is not the worst, but certainly not the best in this regard. Well, so if those tax revenues from the state are no longer supporting public higher education, then who is? Well, this is showing you the exact same thing. It's before and after the recession, and going from 2008 to 2017. During that period, how much has tuition changed at public universities in each state here? And what you can see is that it has gone up in every single state. This is inflation adjusted, so this is not just going up at the rate of inflation. The cost of public higher education is rising much faster than inflation. That's not too bad in some states. It's radically bad in other states. Again, West Virginia, not the best and not the worst, but the cost of a WVU education has apparently gone up 47% during this period, in the absence of all that state funding that we've been watching disappear in the last few slides. So we're not getting as much funding from the state. The student is now responsible for a larger proportion of the cost. And this is showing you the percentage of total educational revenue, that is the total amount of money that universities are taking in the United States. It's showing you what percentage of that total revenue, which includes state and federal money as well as money from students, is being contributed from the students as tuition. What you can see here is that each time there's a recession, the amount that a student has to contribute through tuition pops up and doesn't really go back down again. And during this last bad recession, it continues to go up and plateaus here. Until now, the proportion of your public higher education that you're expected to pay for in 2015 is twice as much, roughly, as it was in 1989. Right? So this is the long-term trend in public higher education in the United States. But that said, we're giving people all these great degrees and they're getting all these great skills and going out and getting good jobs, so they could probably afford to pay for more education, right? Not exactly. So this orange line is how much tuition per student is increasing from 1973 to 2013. It goes up a lot. And if you are one of the richest 1% of people in the country, your income might be almost keeping pace with this up until about 2008, when now you're going to be in trouble. But if you are everybody else, which is this line, your income is not going up at all, while the cost of tuition that you're going to have to pay to get a college education is skyrocketing. So how are people paying for this? In the United States, there's a number of different answers, right? So this line is showing you, this is now a much shorter time scale. This is only from the 1990s to 2015. And this is showing you that the amount that people are getting through grants, and these usually come from the federal government, although sometimes from the state, these are more than doubling. They're rising dramatically. And then there's also huge growth in federal loans. These are loans that are guaranteed by the federal government. And then there might be some other amount of aid they get. And this is, all told, is contributing a fair bit more money towards the contribution that students have to make to their education. But that's actually not all of it. Instead, people are also having to take out private loans, and these ones are not subsidized by the government. They're not interest-free. And so what do we see here? At a public four-year university, this is, again, in inflation-adjusted dollars per student. In 1999, and this is already well after the trend has started, the average student has $5,400 in debt in a year for a public four-year university. And by 2015, that has gone up about 50%. And you have $7,800 in debt per year. This is mapping out government loans that are being given to students. This is actually the total amount rather than per student. And you can see this, again, just skyrocketing over the course of the 1990s and 2000s. It's broken down by all the different kinds of governmental loans that exist. This doesn't include private loans that we saw in the last slide, but obviously there's now over $100 billion a year just in government loans being used to finance the higher education industry. This is what student debt looks like, and we've now shortened the timescale even more. So we're not even back in 1973 here. We're just back in 2004, when things have already gotten kind of bad. And just from 2004 to 2017, the amount of total student debt, roughly quadruples. And there's now over $1 trillion of outstanding student debt in the United States as of 2017. So this is 3-year-old data. Right? That's a lot of debt. This is showing you per student, and this is at public universities, the average cumulative debt that they get out of college with. And this is broken down by whether people graduated, that's the sort of blue bars here, or didn't graduate, that's the orange bars. So what you can see here is that there's lots of debt people are graduating with, and it's going up, but there's even more debt, and it's going up even faster for the people who are least going to be able to afford it, namely those who did not I jumped ahead of myself here. That's not what this graph is showing. This is. Okay, I'm sorry, I confused myself. This is a confusing caption. This one is per every borrower, including people who don't get degrees. And this one is for only those who get degrees. So what you can see here is that the people who can at least afford to pay these loans back, the ones who don't end up getting their degrees, tend to have a ton more debt than the people who finish their degrees. And that's because presumably they came into the university with less income to begin with, and they had to borrow more money, right? So this is hurting the most vulnerable students the most. That said, people who go to college make lots of money to pay back those loans, right? Well, some of them do, but student loans have amongst the highest delinquency and default rates of any kind of debt in the American economy. This is showing you 5 broad categories of debt in the U.S. economy, starting from 2003 and going to 2017. And what you can see here is this is delinquent debt, right? So these are money. This is money that people owe that's at least 90 days late. And every category of debt delinquency goes up during the Great Recession in 2009, 2010. That includes credit cards, car loans, home equity, mortgages, and student debt. After that recession is over, all of these categories of delinquency go back down again. People start paying off their debts again, except for student loans, which remain at an extraordinarily high delinquency rate here. This is showing you that 11 or 12% of all the student loans out there are not being paid back. Here's what that looks like more specifically. These are 3-year cohort default rates on student debt in the United States. This is the percentage of people who are not paying their loans back, calculated up to 3 years from when they finished college. So 2012 here is showing you that people who finished college from 2009, 10, and 11, 13.5% of them have stopped paying back their loans by 2012. Right? So this is the last 3 years of loans. And these are extremely high default rates. Very, very high, over 10%. But that actually sort of underestimates it because they're using those 3-year cohorts. And if you track people after that 3-year cohort ends, more and more of them default on the loans until looks like 5 years out or so. 16% of student loans have been defaulted on. That means not paid back. They've missed payments. All right? And in fact, if you track this longer term, those default rates keep going up and up and up and up throughout these people's lifetimes. So 20 years out, a quarter of all student loans have been defaulted on and not paid back. And if you could track it for longer than 20 years, presumably this would keep going up. So this is a projection for what they think is going to happen for people who graduated in 2003 or 2004. They think that 40 to maybe eventually 50% of them will never pay their loans back. Reason why I'm emphasizing this is that no financial industry can actually work if people don't pay back the debt that they take out. So how is this industry supporting itself? Students are not actually paying for most of the massive increases in the cost of higher education. And we saw earlier on that state governments are certainly not paying for it. In fact, they've drastically cut funding over the last 30 years. So who is paying these costs for the massive increases in the cost of higher education? Here's a big part of the answer. The United States federal government has both grant and loan programs that indirectly pay tuition money to both public and private universities. So the federal government's Pell Grants directly fund tuition. This is basically money that goes straight to the university after being passed through a series of accountants, administrators, and various managers. Right? And this goes anywhere from $20 to $40 billion a year. These amounts go up and down a lot because the program is a political football. So different political parties support this to different extents, and they keep cutting the funding and raising the funding and so on and so forth. But it's a lot of money. The federal government also provides an implicit guarantee on their federal Stafford loans, and sometimes it directly subsidizes those loans. This might mean that you don't have to pay interest on the loan, which costs money. It also means that unlike conventional loans, you don't need to have any collateral to take out a Stafford loan. You don't have to have some assets that they can repossess from you in case you don't pay your loan back. And what that means is that the borrowers who actually issue the loans, because it's not the government who are actually doing the loans, they run them through a network of private loan businesses. And those private loan businesses can offer the loans more cheaply and to more people because they have this implicit federal guarantee that will mostly cover the cost of defaults. Basically, the private loan companies are not taking any risk with these loans, so they can afford to offer them more cheaply, and the federal government promises to basically make them whole if the loans go bad. The Congressional Budget Office from the United States government estimated a few years ago that over the next 10 years, the cost of this implicit subsidy that the federal government gives to the student loan industry is around $12 billion a year. And that does not include the cost of administration. So anybody who's ever dealt with American student loans knows that you have gigantic bureaucracies that exist in each location. There's one giant bureaucracy of loan managers at the private loan companies. There's another giant bureaucracy at WVU that deals with these loans. And there's another giant bureaucracy that deals with administering these loans at the federal agencies themselves, the government agencies. And that presumably contributes an even higher amount of cost to the student loan industry that, again, basically the federal government and the taxpayers are paying for. So in the end, it does seem that the United States government is basically paying for public higher education, but instead of funding universities directly, they're funneling it through these grant and loan programs through the federal government instead of allowing states to pay for it. And I think there's a legitimate question here, which is whether the American taxpayer might get better results from just putting the $12 billion a year into university funding, or whether it's really worth filtering that money through this gigantic student loan industry that extracts huge profits from this money. I think that's a legitimate question. The second part of this lecture, I'm going to split off into a separate video. And so now that you understand a little bit about the way that this system is being financed, which is extremely weird, it's worth understanding as well what that does to the functioning of a university. And that's what the final part of this lecture will be about.